Wonderful.
Okay, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on, I guess, where you are. Um, Thank you for joining us for today's Bunker Talk. And before we get into it, there's a quick announcement I want to make about upcoming Bunker Projects events. We want to invite you all to the December 11th dinner party Manja Manja at the Wilkins School Community Center. The event will be an old school spaghetti dinner featuring food by Black Radish Kitchen and Millie's Ice Cream, and aims to raise money for Bunker's people-centered organizational costs like staffing and artist stipends. And I will share a link in the chat right now where you can get tickets if you'll be around. We'd love to see you there. And now a bit about today's event. This webinar is part of our online reviews handoff series, which is designed to provide emerging Black visual artists or writers, creatives, with the opportunity to think and write critically about key topics surrounding their creative practices. Today's program will be building on the handoff's recent text edition, a text called Tits by artist Vina Nweke. And in this text, Nweke reflects on their production of a sculpture series by the same name, exploring the politics of representation, sensuality, and the gaze. And you can find images of those sculptures, and you can read Nweke's essay on bunkerprojects.org. Vina Nweke is a writer and artist based in Pittsburgh, PA. Their work is centered on interrogating materiality and troubling those sticky boundaries of being. They're currently working on their BA in Women's and Genders and Sexuality Studies and Africana Studies from Williams College. They're a member of the Hotbed Collective, and their work has been previously published in the Republic and ANMLY, maybe ANMLY. So thank you all again for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Vina.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's like 8:30 p.m. here in Paris. So for the talk today, I wanted to talk about my tits and my sculpture project. So this project kind of started my senior year of college, the first time around. And it was like an assignment in my sculpture 101 class that was about like figure studies and like rendering the body. So I was already thinking about the body and like thinking about what is a figure, what is a body. I was recently talking to Armani about like the pieces that they're working on right now, and one of the questions that I asked them is like, what do you think is a figure? Like, what is an actual body? And I feel like this question has been like central to my work as a researcher, as an artist, as a writer. So in the written piece, I refer to the body as a torturous, humorous, sedulous substance. Torturous as in excessively lengthy and complex. Humorous as in ludicrous and, absurd, but also kind of funny. Sedulous as in showing dedication and diligence. And so when I use these words to describe like what a body is, I am mostly referring to this project of the human. And so like one of the big books in my life right now is Becoming Human by Zakiya Iman Jackson. And in this book, she talks about like the liberal humanist project of the human, and that's just like the mission to map humanity onto the question of being, like to define a human, like you are a human being, you're not an animal, you're a human being, you're not a thing. And you, like accordingly you have rights as such. Like, however, this body is mapped against the decided otherness of the Black femme body, this Black femme body that has been constructed to hold things that have both been expelled from and threaten the human. And when I say that, a lot of people like want to go into the theory of objection, but like I don't really mess with the theory of objection like that. And like Julia Kristeva is just it's like a Bulgarian French scholar. And I just think it's a nasty kind of theory, and I just don't really like to mess with it like that. But a lot of people think about like this statement in relation to the theory of objection, which is like the theory that there is an ideal body and this body has expelled or removed the parts that it doesn't want, and these parts have manifested into like the black femme body. And like that's kind of what I'm talking about, but I wouldn't go so far as to call it like the theory of objection. um okay, so in terms of like this body being like constructed to hold everything that's kind of been expelled from and kind of like threaten the human, like this liberal humanist project of like you're a human, you're not an animal, like you're a human, you're not a thing, like you're a man, like God gets into it, but we gonna talk about that later. um and so I wanted these tits to be like vessels, because of the fluidification of blackened flesh. This body is forever in a state of change. I'm always thinking about the black body in relation to water and to the act of holding and the act of containing, like just these things that have to be basically cleaned up in order to present an ideal human body. Um, and just thinking about the pressure that comes with that, like the fear of overflowing with all these expectations and these like I want to call them incantations like that have been put onto this body, and not being able to hold all of that. um so like white tits. um so I like, there's an age old question of like, you like tits, so you like the booty, like. And for me, I like the tits. I mean, you can have a little booty, but that's okay. But I'm a tits man. And so I was thinking about breasts. I was thinking about breasts as like once again going to becoming human by, my favorite person, it's Lakia Iman Jackson. Um, she was talking about breasts as like sites of constructed ontological differences. And so like these are like sites of concentrated otherness. Like the black breast is constructed to be like the black breast is like different from all other kind of breasts. Like it is the black titty, like this is like the bestial ontologized like difference. Like this is what in her book she was like, this is what like signifies the animality of like the black female body or like the black and feminized body. And so I was like kind of running with this idea of like these constructed localized sites of ontological difference. Um yeah, and the intermingling of the black female body with the animal, like it's also scary. It's like, bro, like, you're not just a human, you also like it's not even like being part animal, it's like you're forever intertwined with these terms. And so that's what I was thinking about on the other side of that, like sexual, like I guess signification with the breast was also like the ontological like aspect of that as well. um okay, yeah, okay. So I started with these handmade pots, and I think I watched a YouTube video of this guy making like a kettle. And he had like two half circles and he put them together and then he did some other stuff to it. Um and then when I put them together, I realized they were like these balls full of air, and you can kind of like shape them and fold them and like give them form into any way that you want. Yeah. So like I started with these, like the one you see in the middle, like these half circles. Then I put them together and I kind of like beat them with like a little paddle thingy. Um, and at this time I was watching a lot of porn, and we're gonna get into that later, but like I was trying to find different like movements, different like how the titty be sitting in different ways. Like I was trying to capture all of that. And so like with these like balls filled with air, I was able to like mold and sculpt them and give them form and shape. Um and yeah, whenever I sculpt, I always have like, what's my next slide? I always have like these images of, I'm gonna go up to here, of like calabashes. Which are these like pots. They can be made out of clay, they can be like a type of fruit, they can be like made out of rubber. And this is how we have like hold stuff in like Nigerian culture. Um, and so whenever like I sculpt something in my previous works, like Their Eyes Were Watching God, I always think of like these Africanized images, like the calabash. And I was thinking about it, that intention in relation to um vessels and holding in this body that is meant to hold something. And I wanted to like start off with like a vessel that is meant to hold something, if that makes sense. Um, and so around the time of this project, we like a small part of the Hotbed Collective went to New York. Um, I think it was just to see different art and get different inspiration. And at the Whitney Museum, I saw this um, sculpture by Simone Leigh. Excuse me. And this was like during the time that Simone Leigh was like blowing up. I feel like right after I saw this, she became part of like the Venice Bicentennial. So it was like very like current. It was very like, okay, we in it now. So I saw this piece and I was struck by it. I was especially struck by the calabash head. The like her head is a pot, like her titties are out, she's huge. She's clearly African in some way. Um, and like I was also struck by this gesture of like regality, and like she's like holding her arms out in like this like acceptance pose. And that is how I have always wanted to view the Black female body. But in it I was also struck by its fleshy potentiality, its fleshy potential, like the creaminess of the skin, the brownness. Like it was invoking a body but also creating a barrier as a thing. Like her head is a pot, like she's a thing. um so when I saw this, I started thinking about Annie Chang and ornamentalism, in relation to the thingification of Blackened bodies. And I'm going to explain more about thingification a little bit later. But for ornamentalism, um, Annie Chang writes, ornamentalism is about a fantasy of turning things into persons through the conduit of racial meaning in order, paradoxically, to allow the human to escape his or her own humanness. And she writes of Afeng Moy, who was quote unquote the first Chinese woman in America. And she was like exhibited as the Chinese woman, I think throughout New York. I'm not sure. So she wrote of this woman, and she was like, a woman's close proximity to China allows her to be read as a particular kind of surface, perfectly contained, perfectly empty, but also perfectly coextensive. Annie Chang talks about the haunting of the body in terms of Asian femininity in things like porcelain and China, and how this seals that specific body in controlling terms like dainty, beautiful, fragile. Um, so I was thinking about that kind of ornamentalism, that kind of the erotic like inclination to embody a thing through like proximity. And I was thinking about that in terms of what that means for the Black and feminized body, for the Black female body. And so the Black and female body also acts as a conduit for the erotic pleasure of embodying a thing through the act of racialization. I wanted to focus on this eroticism and this tension. However, instead of being perfectly contained, perfectly empty, perfectly coextensive, I was like, what if we like put stuff in her? Like, what if we fill her up? And that's like where this imagery of the like the pop comes in. Um, and I wanted to focus fully on the porous boundaries of person and thing and how that is also mapped against the Black female body. And so the tits become a vessel, tits hold, you know, tits are great. So calabashes to me are erotic things because they're bulbous, they're round, they hold things like they're like tits, you know. Um, so I was like, you know, like she has this calabash for her head, her tits are out. Like let's cut the middleman, like for real. Um, like let's really get to what we want to see. Um, and so during the same week, I saw a series of paintings by John Kieran at the Gagosian, and they were so like erotic and weird and a little grotesque, and they were just invoking a lot of like emotion, but they also had this like fleshy aspect, once again bringing in this like fleshy potentiality of like something that is rendered, invoking like the actual body. um so yes, I was like on the mission to cut out the middleman. I was like so focused on their tits, and I was like, let's make some tits. I think this is like part of the reason I decided to make the whole, yeah, anyways. um but I wanted to focus on like kind of like this uncomfortable feeling that accompanies like viewing these images. And this is a part that I suspect stems from, like I said, the process of viewing and displaying and objectifying, and that once again brings us back to thingification. But like let's make it hot and sexy. Um, so like I mentioned before, let's get into thingification. Like I mentioned before, the ornamentalism is about the proximity of like embodying a thing, like through ornaments, through like you're close to these things, therefore you become these things. While thingification for me is like not about this, like you are the thing, like the middleman is like cut, like you are this thing, you're thingified. However, both work around the same process of racialization. And even further for the Black female body, the process of transmorgification. So of being experimented with as everything and nothing on a lexical and biological scale, of being used as a point to map being, this incredibly painful process of being ontology's nadar, um, going back to like the fluidification of Black flesh, of being like the base zero form, like yeah. Um, so in this, and throughout the rest of the thing is just like different images of the tits. I'm just gonna flip through them as I as I go. Um, so in this instance, I wanted to spend a little more time because, like I said, this process of transmogrification, of being experimented with as everything and nothing, unlike the levels of matter and language, as like a very painful process. And I wanted to focus a little bit more on the other side of this coin, and not to think dichotomously, and we hate Descartes and his dualism, but the um the other side of pain for me is like pleasure. So I wanted to focus on the entanglement of desire and pleasure with the mechanisms of racialization, or even further, transmorgification. And one of my leading questions was, can we find pleasure or desire within this reality? Um, so for me, this is like I mentioned before, this is where porn studies kind of comes in. Like I said, I was literally in the sculpture studio, like on Pornhub, like trying to find like forms and shapes that were like that I wanted to mold into these clay bodies. And so for me, when I think of porn studies, I think of specifically, excuse me, I think of specifically the works of Jennifer Nash in The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography. I haven't finished reading this book yet. There's an intro in about 4 chapters, and I'm on chapter 2. Um, but in the intro, she talks about countering the mission of Black feminist scholarship and finding the wound and dressing the wound, and this wound that comes from the flesh being painfully ripped open in the process of transmogrification, of being like, you know, the thing where matter is like we're wresting matter from this. Like I said, that's a very painful process. And she asks the question, is it possible to find pleasure for the Black female body? And her work specifically analyzes porn, like archival porn and like old vintage stuff. Like she has images in the book. So if like anyone is interested in reading this book with me, let me know. It's really cool. Um, but what I took from this book, what I've read so far, is the confrontation of the ever-present pornographic gaze um, for the Black female body. This inherent eroticization that happens for this body, how this body elicits desire that is also immediately thrown into despair. And the immediacy of it is like most important because in the process of transmogrification is like Blackness becomes simultaneously everything and nothing. Like it is happening all at the same time. It's not a succession of events. It's like the Big Bang. Like it's happening like immediately. And that's when this becomes like incredibly painful because it's like the the pressure of like immediacy, if that makes sense. I feel like I said immediacy too many times. Um, but what was desire. So yes, how the body elicits desire that is immediately thrown into despair. So we have desire and despair that's working on the body. Um Desire on one hand, um for this body that we have designated as the other, as you know, the one that we set aside, that we put and pour all these things that have been expelled from and threaten the ideal human body. But also like despair for what it means for the viewing party, for like your own body, and the fear that accompanies that. I feel like some lines of theory talk about like you are what you like, it's like you are what you eat. It's like because you desire this body, do you become this body? And that's like one of like the anxieties that kind of surround this. So however, rather than focus on this wound of, you know, the flesh being ripped open in the autopoetic process of transmogrification, I wanted to draw attention instead to the politics of the gaze. And I was thinking about what Nicole Fleetwood, in her book Troubling Vision. There's a second part of the title, but I'm not remembering. But she writes that the politics of the gaze, that's my part, demonstrates that the visual sphere is a performative field where seeing race is not a transparent act. It is itself a doing. So like we always, or at least for me, I always have to remember, because race is like such a solidified ideology within society right now. I always have to remind myself that race is not these things out there that are like waiting to be like happen upon. Like the process of racialization is an active process that is always going on. Like blackening, like it's not fact. Like race is still at the end of the day just an ideology that has to be practiced. Um, so to this point, um I remember a moment after the show. I had because I was originally set up in the lobby and I had like put the display of my tits to the side, like in the hallway. And I went back one day to take pictures and like do some other stuff. And I just noticed, like as I walked into this building, there was this like white man and he was like standing in front of the display and he was like arms crossed, looking so confused, so befuddled. He was walking back and forth. It was hilarious. And I just kind of like stayed up to the side and like just kind of looked at him for a little bit, and then he eventually left. Um, but I figured this moment as a moment of racialization that is entangled with pleasure and desire, where seeing race is like an act of doing. I would call this moment a Fanonian moment. Let's see if I remember what a Fanonian moment is. I haven't read Fanon in so long. So the Fanonian moment, Fanon was in France, I think. He was at a grocery store. And then a white child was like, "Hey, look, a nigger," and he was like, "Whoa!" So I'm the nigger. And and in that moment, it's like what the way I remember Sylvia Winter reading this moment was like that moment, the moment of racialization becomes like a physical thing for the body, like the body like physically, biologically reacts to being racialized, to being blackened in that moment. Um, and like Sylvia Winter, a lot of Black feminists call for the complication of the Fanonian moment because a lot of people are like, okay, what if Fanon was a Black woman? What if the white mom of the white child was like a white dad instead? And like all these things that are being added to like kind of complicate the moment. And so I thought it was like a perfect example of a complicated Fanonian moment, where he was staring at the tits. The white man was staring at the tits, and me, the Black femme, was staring at the white man staring at the Black tits, and it was like tricky. Um, so, um, and I was like doing this without his knowledge. Um, and so like this moment is becomes like a cementation of the otherness of the Black female body. He was clearly confused by what he saw. Um, and while he was in that moment, I was thinking like what could possibly be going through his mind. And then this also like takes me back to another like Nicole Fleetwood um like quote where she addresses this process in which the visual manifestation of Blackness through technological apparatus or through material experience of locating Blackness in the public sphere equates with an ontological account of Black subjects. Once again, thingification, where is this the thing or is this the body? And it's like that collapse of person and thing in that moment. So his gaze fixes the tits in their paralyzing blackness. So the question I had is like, what does my gaze add to that situation? Um, what does my proximity to the tits in that moment um, what is that my proximity to the tits in that moment where the process of racialization is subjected to my voyeuristic gaze? Do I get to participate in the erotic practice of escaping my own humanness through my proximity to ornaments and things? It's like, is it like I always find it interesting, and this is like one of the things that I'm working through in my pieces is like the difference between ornamentalism and thingification. And so my motivating questions are like, where does desire and pleasure exist for the Black femme body in the constant process of transmogrification? Um, like, why was I tickled silly by seeing this man looking so confused? And like, how does that open up, um, I guess, alternative embodiments for this Black femme body? Yeah, that's my spiel. um,
Thank you for that. That was amazing. It's so good to hear. I mean, it's interesting to hear, you talk a lot about some of your influences like Corinne and Lee in the essay, but I think, as is required by essays, there's a lot that we had to leave out just for brevity's sake. And so um as someone who worked with you a lot on editing that, it's exciting for me to hear all of that and to understand kind of some of the different facets that you weren't able to cover, and some of the references, the more academic stuff that you were looking through as you produced this, and maybe have been since producing and reflecting on it. So now I thought we could maybe open it up for a few questions. If anyone in the audience today is interested or had some questions they want to pose to Vina. Yes, Kay.
Hi. So I just want to preface this by saying that I thought the talk was amazing. And so I really enjoyed it. I was particularly struck by your usage of transmorgification, right, as a process for how the Blackened feminized body becomes a vessel, right, and becomes a legible text that is erased and re-erased over and over. I wonder, Vina, if you could speak about what that process entails. Is it something that is random? Because when I think of transmorphication, I think of like something that is almost magical. And I know you had mentioned fantasy earlier, and maybe you could speak a little bit about that, please.
so it's actually hilarious because like being in Paris, I'm like kind of understanding like transmorphic transmorgification as like a word more, because it's like, to me, I'm just seeing like this cartoon image where like you're sitting in a chair and you're like getting brainwashed, and like different images are like flashing at you, and it's like, which one do you pick? And I feel like that's, to me, on the other side, I still haven't conceptualized what this process means for me, but for the other party, it's like transmogrification becomes this moment of like self-actualization where they're like flipping through forms, like actively trying to decide which one they land on. And they're performing this through like your body, like your flesh. And like this fantasy aspect is like, it's like we could be whatever. And that's the thing about transmogrification. It's like you could be whatever, like you could be anything in that moment. And it's like a process, it's like an ordering process, is a way to provide order to like certain things. So in the process of transmogrification, like the Black female body, like my Black female body is like, we're trying on different images, we're trying to fit on different things, and we're trying to see which one sticks that would like provide order to the party that is like, to the other party that's doing this. I don't know if that makes sense, or if that's what you wanted me to get at.
No, I think that makes sense. That makes sense to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or
Yeah.
questions? I have more material question that
Yes.
I was interested in the beaded components to the tit sculptures that you didn't really discuss, and
Mm-hmm.
whether or not you could talk a little bit about the decision-making process that led to those.
I think the indecision, it was also like kind of this thing between like ornaments, like ornamentalism and like ornament putting ornaments on these things. It was like a process of like beautifying, like kind of adding to their thinginess of like these breasts. So something it's like kind of troubling, like this thing that is meant to be like purely ornamental. It's like I made these beads as decorations, but then they also like add meaning in their own sort of way. And like I said, I'm still not sure what any of this means. I just like have a lot of questions that I'm trying to work through. But yeah, it was like the ornamentalism aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what they do for me, at least, is it specifically related to ornamentation. Is it's like they put in contrast. You talk about how some of these theorists frame breasts as like a kind of ornamentation, or the way that they're structured, their way that we are taught to perceive them is as a form of ornamentation. And so by adding this like very clearly aesthetic intervention of the beads makes that contrast really clear between the way that, breasts are functional objects, but it maybe highlights our desire to read them as ornamentation and makes us aware of that in
Yeah.
the read of the piece. But anyway, any last questions maybe before we wrap up for this afternoon?
I do have one more question.
Yes, Kate.
So I was thinking also about these images, right? Or how these images become self-referential, right? We defer to these images in order to gain a sense of self, right? Even though that sense of self might be something that is imposed onto you. I think this is less of a question for the person who is doing the imposing, more so a question of the person who is being imposed on, right? Like, how do we make sense of these references? What do we do? What do we do with them, right? Is it a self-perpetuating process? How do we break out of them? How do we make sense of that? I think that's my question.
So how does the person that is being imposed on make sense of the images that are being imposed on them? Is
Yes,
that
I think
okay?
why we keep going back to those references as well.
Okay. Hold on. I think once again, it like comes down to order. Like it comes down to like epistemology, the way that we know what we know and how we provide like order to that. Because in like science, there's this I forget what it's called, but like this theory that the universe is devolving into chaos. And so like you have these branches of thought that kind of come about because we are trying to provide order to a world that we deem inherently like disordered. So like these images, these like controlling images, and for example, like a controlling image is like can be the image of like the Black Venus. Um, these images like become they are like self-fulfilling processes in a way because like they have entered into like our epistemology, into our mode of thought. And so like I'm thinking of what Lacan said about like thoughts being like re-inscribing themselves, like every thought has to come from somewhere. It's kind of like that thing where like everything has to come from somewhere, and this is like what is already like in our consciousness. And so um even if we're trying to move against it, we're trying to subvert it, we're trying to embrace it, we're trying to do something with it at all times. So it's like, why do we keep going back to them? Is because like that's like the dominant order, like that's what has been put into like the way we know things. And it's like now we constantly have to be at tension with it, we constantly have to like we don't, and I guess that's like another question that I have, like maybe we don't constantly have to like acknowledge and address these things, but I think at least for me, starting off before we get into like the more experimental modes of being that move beyond kind of taking into account these controlling images that already exist about us, um I think I'm in a moment where I'm still fighting with them, and I think it's like a progression of thought. It's like, once again, starting from somewhere, starting from what we know in our epistemology, starting from the order that has been provided, and kind of like devolving past that. So I think in terms of like going back to these references, I bring them up in order to like, and I bring up a lot of like specifically on the Black Venus, I invoke the Black Venus a lot. I bring it up to like highlight the way that we know things. Like this is like baked into the consciousness, and that's why we keep going back to it, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes sense. It's like
Okay.
we've seen this iconography so many times. We've become familiar
Mm-hmm.
with it. We inadvertently regurgitate it in order to create something new, but it might not necessarily be that, but it feels new to us, right?
Yeah.
Or textually, it might just be the same thing.
Yeah. And it's like, it's also like that question of like, is anything new? Like,
Right.
I feel like we're also in like this stage of like late stage capitalism where everything is just kind of like an iteration of something we've done before. And
Right.
that's what it like feels like we're steeped in at this moment. So it like, what does new mean? Like what
Right.
is like like disciplining versus redisciplining? Like
Right.
what does that mean, you know?
Mm-hmm. Very big questions. Thank you, Vina.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question, Vina.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry. I was thinking a lot about what you were saying about like surfaces and like what Chang mentions about like surfaces like porcelain, and you'd like describe like the surface, like the creaminess of the surface of like lay sculptures. And like having looked at your works like up close and like having had the privilege of like even running my fingers across them, like I'm really struck by like the choices you made about surface in the works, and I think it'd be really interesting to hear more about your thoughts.
Yeah, so I wanted them to be evocative of like the textures of the body. Like when you touch the body, or like when you like really peruse a titty, like there's gonna be dents and things, and like it's not gonna be perfectly round. The nipples can be grainy. So I just really wanted to not like, I feel like it was also a moment where it's like, sorry. It was a, what was I saying? It was a moment of like turning these things into like things. It was like a moment of like thingification. Like I wanted these to read like real breasts. And I think Simone Lee takes a different approach where hers is like really smooth, really like fine, and that's like invokes another like object potentiality. But I wanted to work with a different type of like object. Like the tits are the objects, and let's just like really like make them the objects. So like I didn't want the surfaces to be smooth. I wanted them to be like very like material, very like fleshy, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's maybe a great place to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. And thank you again, Vina, so much for your incredible essay, the artwork, and this lovely presentation. Before you all go, I want to remind you again that December 11th, if you're in Pittsburgh or in the Pittsburgh area, our Manja Manja event will be a great time for everyone in the bunker community to get together. And importantly, to remind you all also to keep an eye out for our next piece in the Handoff series written by Kay Gibson, titled Celestial Echoes. And in the piece, Gibson explores techno's origins in the displacement of Black laborers by technology and its resonances with religious experience and its potential to reveal essential truths about ourselves. That will be coming out shortly next month and also be accompanied by an exciting bunker talk in a new form. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And with that, I will let you all go. Have a great weekend.